Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here, and welcome back at long last to episode 2 of the Airbrushing 101 series, where I go over and explain aspects of the miniature airbrushing world. Before I go on, I'd just like to thank you all so much for the very warm reception of the series back in episode 1. The general consensus that I gathered was positive, so it will be continuing for the foreseeable future. Your engagement in the comments was also fantastic, and it allowed for the selection of today's topic, which will be on the subject of fine detail spraying, whether that be creating fine pre-shading, mottling, demarcation lines, or really anything else that requires another level of attention to detail. I'll be going over optimizing your airbrush setup, thinning ratios and additives, as well as some tips on spraying technique in order to give you guys the best head start possible for this relatively complex aspect of airbrushing. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. When it comes to achieving sharp, repeatable and crisp spraying results, regardless of what it is you're spraying, the backbone of your setup is the compressor. Delivering a consistent, low humidity stream of air is the first step in achieving good results, so ensuring your compressor is up to scratch is paramount. You don't have to look for big brand names or towering price tags in this department. However, the three main things I do recommend you check for are an air storage tank, a moisture trap, and crucially, an adjustable pressure valve. Having an additional storage tank in parallel with the compressor unit will mean that it isn't playing a constant game of catch-up with your airbrush, allowing for a constant pressure output to meet the demand without any drop-offs. Additionally, a moisture trap will help to at least partially remove the water from the air that you're spraying, resulting in much better atomization and therefore a smoother, less grainy finish in your paint jobs. This is especially important in climates that tend to be more humid, or even just moderate climates that get denser during the summer, like here in the UK. If your compressor doesn't have a moisture trap, I'd highly recommend buying one and retrofitting it if you can. Lastly, an adjustable pressure valve is absolutely crucial. Fine detail spraying is all about fine-tuning every parameter to achieve optimal spraying conditions, and if you're unable to play with your pressure output, you're severely handicapped right from the start. Overall, so long as you have these three elements, most compressors should be fine. Obviously, different price brackets come with different build quality and different features. However, my advice would be to watch some reviews, get a general vibe, and then make your purchase based on those factors along with your available budget. Once you have a suitable compressor, the airbrush itself matters less. Obviously, you'll again notice differences in manufacturing and build quality, as well as functionality as you climb the price ladder. But just having a £30 Fengder, for example, definitely does not make you incapable of spraying lovely fine details. In fact, with some fine-tuning, you'll still be able to achieve impressive results. The two critical components to look out for, though, in an airbrush are the nozzle and needle, essentially the business end of the tool. Your nozzle should be completely clear of blockages or paint residue, and the needle should be grease-free with an undamaged tip. A damaged needle tip, even if it's only slightly bent, can result in a grainier finish than without. So an easy way to check if your needle is in good condition is what I call a tissue test. Essentially, take a square of toilet tissue or a kitchen roll and gently pull the needle backwards across its surface, under its own weight. If the needle is healthy, you should hear very little sound. However, if there's a slight bend at the tip, you'll hear a faint scratching sound as it pulls across the surface. Damaged needles can be repaired using specialized tools. However, these can get quite pricey, and they're only really worth it if you're running a higher-end airbrush that commands high replacement costs. For most budget airbrushes, buying a replacement needle shouldn't set you back too much. As for the nozzle, if it does have any form of blockages, soaking it in the solvent corresponding to the type of paint that you spray should loosen it all back up, followed by a thorough clean out with a fine, stiff brush. For stubborn blockages, you can soak it in heavier duty solvents like Tamiya Airbrush Cleaner. However, be aware that if your nozzle has a built-in O-ring, you may want to remove it before soaking to avoid any damage. White-coloured Teflon O-rings generally should be fine, but do be careful with traditional black rubber O-rings as they're more susceptible to solvent damage. In terms of actual nozzle and needle size, I tend to recommend no larger than 0.2mm for fine detail work, as this tends to be optimum for most types of paint and for most people's needs. I do like using my 0.15mm nozzle, however, as it just offers that extra edge over the 0.2. However, it's not the end of the world if you can't get yourself one. Other than this, there are a handful of other elements that you can fine-tune depending on what airbrush you have. Some airbrushes have trigger limiters, which some people like to use to avoid overspray. However, I personally don't really bother with mine. They can be good for beginners though, so it's totally up to you. On some higher end airbrushes you can also adjust the trigger sensitivity, so playing with this can help if you like a little bit more trigger resistance. Additionally, ensuring your needle is fully seated into the nozzle by unlocking the nut and adjusting its position will ensure that no paint will flow unless you pull the trigger back, avoiding any unintentional overspray. Finally, a small thing you can adjust if you have a Harder & Steenbeck Infinity or Evolution airbrush is the trigger pad angle. Not many people know this, but with a little bit of force you can rotate the angle of the finger pad from side to side, which can make it more comfortable depending on your finger positioning and your spraying style. But obviously this is totally up to the individual. That essentially sums up the hardware setup, so let's now discuss paint thinning ratios and additives. If you've seen episode 1 of this series, you'll know that in general, lacquer paints tend to provide smoother and more controllable results. However, this doesn't mean you can't achieve respectable results with water-based acrylics. Just be aware that it might be more challenging to spray with them, and their formulation could be a limiting factor in the final result. Regardless of the type of paint you're spraying, however, the crucial element here is thinning ratio. Thinning ratio will be different for everyone, dependent on the type of paint, the viscosity of that particular batch, spraying conditions, air pressure, distance from the model, etc. However, a good place to start for most unthinned paints is a ratio of 6 parts thinner to 4 parts paint. From here, you may need to adjust it quite a bit, or maybe not at all, but constantly testing on a throwaway or testbed model is essential before you go to town on the actual thing. As you gain more experience, you'll learn how to thin your paint by eye. However, to begin with, working to fixed ratios and testing the result is a safe place to start. So, with all of that covered, it's almost time to start spraying. This is the part of the process where the result is largely down to experience and a lot of practice. However, I do have a handful of tips that can help you in general, as well as tips for certain types of camo patterns or details. One more thing you will need to do, however, before you start spraying is to set your pressure. Using the regulator on the compressor, I normally sit mine at around 15 to 20 psi. However, some people like to go down all the way to 10. I personally feel most in control in the 15 to 20 range though, so it's literally just down to the individual. Right, onto these spraying tips. Tip number 1. Find your airbrush's balance point and practice maintaining it. Much like finding the balance point of a car's clutch, there will be a point where pulling the trigger of your airbrush back by a specific amount balances right on the edge of the no paint/paint boundary. And knowing this point is crucial when it comes to fine detail work. Mastering this balance point will allow for optimal control over how much paint is being sprayed at any given point in time, mitigating against over-application and potential detrimental effects like spidering or tide marks. This is a skill that just needs a bit of practice to get right, so a testbed model again definitely comes in handy here. Again though, fine-tuning your airbrush's trigger sensitivity can also help to improve your trigger control. Tip number 2. Make sure you actively manage and mitigate against tip dry, which is a very common occurrence when spraying low paint volumes at low pressures. Tip dry is an effect where small amounts of paint start to cure on the tip of the nozzle, potentially leading to speckling or a reduced paint flow. The danger here is that you start noticing a lower paint flow rate, and you compensate by pulling the trigger back more. However, in doing so, you clear the blockage and a big unintentional burst of paint comes out and ruins your paint job. This is something that so many people experience when they first start airbrushing, myself included. However, it is easily mitigated. The easiest way of doing so is when you start noticing the effects of tip dry buildup, stop spraying your model and spray a couple of bursts of paint at full blast into a tissue or just generally into the spray booth away from the model. This usually clears it and you can carry on spraying your model straight away as normal. Alternatively, if your airbrush has a pinch style nozzle protector like on the Harder & Steenbeck Evo and Infinity, you can physically clear away tip dry using a tissue dampened with thinner. If you are finding that you experience abnormal levels of tip dry, you may benefit from adding a few drops of paint retarder to your paint mixture before spraying. Most paint brands have specific retarders for each line of paint, sometimes marketed as flow improvers or similar names, so just have a look to see what's on offer. Tip number 3. Try and avoid something that I call airflow spatter, which is an effect that happens when you release the trigger completely and then immediately reapply air pressure. What can sometimes happen here is when you do this, a small amount of liquid paint can form a blob on the end of the needle when airflow ceases, and when airflow returns, that blob is dispersed in the form of a very small initial spatter that can create some very undesirable effects, as you can see in this demonstration. Again though, mitigating against this is very easy, and all you need to do if you ever release the trigger is point the airbrush away from the model, reapply airflow, allowing the spatter to go elsewhere, and then point the airbrush back towards your model whilst maintaining airflow the whole time. You can then refine the balance point and continue spraying. Over time, you'll start to do this instinctively, however, it's a very good habit to get into from the start. Tip number 4. Less is always more when it comes to final detail spraying. You can always layer up your effects and build up opacity, but it's much harder to take it away without starting over from scratch. This is an especially important thing to remember for beginners in general, but also for all skill levels when spraying effects like mottling on German aircraft or demarcation lines between camo colours. Spraying a very light, almost unnoticeable initial layer can almost act like spraying guidelines or sketch lines on your model, helping you to map out what you're actually spraying rather than diving in headfirst with full opacity application. Spraying subtle layers to begin with can also help to identify if your paint is too thick or if you need to further optimize your setup, as graininess in the paint will be immediately identifiable without any ill effects on the surface of the model that can't be rectified. Tip number 5. Always be conscious of overspray and the direction at which you're spraying each colour. This is especially important when spraying 2 or 3 tone camo schemes, where each colour features in blocks with a defined demarcation line, much like RAF 2-tone or German 3-tone. Always make sure you angle your overspray so that it lands on areas that will be the colour that you're currently spraying anyway, so that the demarcation line doesn't become hazy or uneven. For example, if you're spraying RAF dark green on top of already applied RAF dark earth, always spray towards the dark green patches when creating the demarcation lines. Tip number 6. Use spraying distance to your advantage and get used to the effects that each distance creates with the nozzle size that you use. Proximity to the model when spraying dictates how fine the detail is going to be, as well as its sharpness, so optimal distance can vary depending on what it is you're spraying, as well as the scale of the model. For example, you'll want to have the nozzle closer to the model when spraying camo patterns in 172 than in 148, as the haze around the demarcation lines or mottling would also decrease with scale. And finally, tip number 7 is to just have fun with it, and don't get frustrated if the results don't come immediately. As I've said previously in the video, spraying fine details is without a doubt the hardest thing to master when it comes to airbrushing your models. So in turn, that will always come with a steeper learning curve. But if you stick with it, you'll see improvements in no time. So that pretty much covers everything I wanted to go over in this video. I really hope you all found it useful, especially those of you who specifically requested this video in the previous episode's poll. If there's anything else you feel I missed out or want me to expand on, please don't hesitate to pop a comment down below, and I'll do my best to answer you as soon as possible. Additionally, as with Airbrushing 101 tradition, feel free to add your own tips down below so that together we can make this video a really effective, collaborative knowledge sharing tool. Speaking of the collaborative aspect, I'll soon be working on episode 3 of the series, and that's where you guys come in yet again. Make sure to comment down below what you want episode 3 to be about, and after a week or so, I'll take the idea with the most likes and I'll turn it into a video. I may also get the 4 most popular suggestions and turn it into a poll on my channel feed, so stay tuned for that. With all that said, all that's left to do is thank all of you so much for watching this far. I really appreciate it. I'd also like to take this moment to say a massive thanks to all of my amazing channel members here on YouTube. Your support is absolutely incredible, and I really hope you're enjoying the perks that come with your membership. If you'd like to find out more about what being a channel member entails, feel free to click that link in the description down below for more info. Thank you all so much yet again. As I said, I hope you all enjoyed that one and found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode, as well as my next build video, which will be coming very soon, fingers crossed. Take care and keep on modelling. Bye.